This is Lecture 123C, Building Socialism Part 3 in the ABCs of Communism series of lectures to accompany Volume 7 on Communism in Europe. And now we're going to talk about the 1926 to 1927 Budget Authorization. And these are not dry lectures necessarily, because they're about a lot more than just facts and figures. And as you saw last time, the last fiscal year before the Great Turn was 1926 to 1927. Then the solution Stalin told Sorge he had in mind would begin with the collectivization of agriculture. Now that budget featured a Reven-Sovet request. That's not Reven-Soviet, it's Reven-Sovet. That's the military request for 613 million rubles. Plus whatever amount the Rycoff Commission thought would be necessary over this minimum readiness request to solve the urgent problems that they were confronting. Now, what was this additional request all about? Well, in April 1925, Alexei Rycoff, the Prime Minister, then decided to create a special commission called the Rycoff Commission to evaluate areas of conflict between government agencies. Now, this body was to act as a separate and independent advisory body to the Prime Minister within the Sovnarkom, that is, the Council of Ministers. It consisted of 6 men, with 1, Premier Alexei Rycoff as chairman, 2, Lev Kamenev as vice chair. The other 4 were 3, Felix Dzerzhinsky, director of the Cheka, and the Commissar of the National Economic Council, that is, the Commissariat of Industry, or Vysenka. As all the Cheka obtained, foreign technology was to be inserted in the industrial complex. 4, Commissar Michael Fruntz for the Red Army and Red Navy Commissariat. 5, Deputy Commissar for the Red Army and Red Navy Commissariat, Clement Voroshilov. And finally, number 6, Gregory Sokolnikov, Chief Commissar of the People's Commissariat for Finance. The treasurer, in other words. Now, the Rycoff Commission and General Tukhachevsky's proposal for preventive war. It was the underlying issue of this particular budget year. By 1926, one area of contention was the budget fight, now of greater significance because of the danger of imminent foreign attack, which General Tukhachevsky was campaigning to meet with a first strike. That is, a preventive war to be initiated by the Red Army specifically against Poland and Romania. On January 19, 1926, Rycoff replaced Kamenev, becoming sole chairman of the Soviet Council on Labor and Defense, abbreviated STO. The STO was a body Lenin had chaired before his stroke, and which Kamenev had chaired since that time until now. Originally, when Lenin was chairman, it had played the essential role in the articulation of the needs of the army and industry during the Civil War. Now, under Kamenev's leadership, it had atrophied. Part of this was because the Reven-Sovet had grown in importance in making recommendations and overseeing their implementation in matching the army with the needs of civilian industry. Part of this atrophy was due to the Kamenev's laziness. Now, at any rate, Rycoff now had independent instruments of analysis in his hands. On July 28, 1926, the Commission recommended an additional authorization of 510 million rubles, on top of the 613 million ruble basic allocation already authorized by the Central Committee. However, the Finance Commissariat, Narkomfin, refused to go along. It would not, under any circumstances, authorize more than 700 million rubles for the military without additional revenue streams, regardless of preventive war mobilization. So, that, as usual, Sokolnikov had put a cap and saying, well, this is as much as you can have. I don't care what your recommendations are. And so as the end of 1927 approached, there were other crises the government faced, specifically the scissors crisis in agriculture, the falling behind in preparation of infrastructure for acquired industrial equipment implantation, and the collapse of the China policy. Now, these were now aggravated by this deadlock over ruble levels of military and military-industrial complex spending. And I discussed in earlier lectures, I've already gone over what happened in China. You can go back and read that particular those chapters in Volume 1, or you can look at the lectures. Now, Alexei Rycoff was the head of government, that is the prime minister, after Lenin, of both the Soviet Republic and the Soviet Union until 1930. And then Molotov took over as the new head of government. On 13th of February 1881, Alexei Rycoff was born in Saratov, Russia. His father died in Merv of cholera in 1889. His sister, who worked for the railroad, raised him. He became an atheist in high school, where he excelled in science and mathematics. In 1898, he joined the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and 2 years later, in 1900, he attended Kazan University as a pre-law student. In 1903, he joined Lenin's Bolsheviks when the RSDLP split. In 1905, Rycoff was active in the Bolshevik campaign within the Russian Revolution of that year in Petrograd and Moscow. He was in the preparatory committee for the National Armed Insurrection Lenin had set to begin on 1 April 1906. When that failed to happen, he traveled to London for the RSDLP Rump Third Bolshevik Congress. Martov organized his own RSDLP Rump Third Menshevik Congress simultaneously in Zurich. I'm going back over this so you see why Rycoff was so important in the minds of the leadership that when Lenin was removed by his stroke, they appointed him. In 1906, he traveled to the Fourth Bolshevik Congress in Copenhagen. In 1907, he attended the Fifth All-Factions RSDLP Congress in London, where Lenin brought him onto the Bolshevik Central Committee as a candidate member. In 1912, Rycoff was captured by the Okhrana and exiled to Siberia, that is the Tsar's secret police. There he remained until the February 1917 revolution. He returned initially to Petrograd, where Stalin picked him as one of the Bolshevik Party delegates to the Petrograd, that is St. Petersburg or Leningrad City Council, or Soviet. At the Stalin-organized July to August 1917 6th Congress in Petrograd, Rycoff was elected as a full member to the Central Committee. Lenin approved this, of course, although Stalin had him in hiding in Finland when this Congress was held secretly in Petrograd. During the Bolshevik Revolution of 24 to 26 October, Old Style, Rycoff was a member of the Military Revolutionary Committee that was conducting the seizure of power in its name. When the seizure was complete, and Lenin announced said completion with himself as chairman of the Government of People's Commissars, in other words, as prime minister of the insurrectionary government, Rycoff was named Interior or Police Commissar or Minister in this first Red government. And from Wikipedia, I think it's worth quoting this. On April 3, 1918, Rycoff was appointed chairman of the Supreme Council of the National Economy, which is NEC in this text and Vesenka in most texts, and served in that capacity throughout the Russian Civil War. On July 5, 1919, he also became a member of the reorganized Revolutionary Military Council, where he remained until October 1919. From July 1919 until August 1921, he was also a special representative of the Council of Labor and Defense for food supplies for the Red Army and Navy. Rycoff was elected to the Communist Party Central Committee on April 5, 1920, after the Ninth Party Congress, and became a member of its Org Bureau, that's the Organizational Bureau, where he remained until May 23, 1924. Once the Bolsheviks emerged victorious in the Civil War, Rycoff resigned his Supreme Council of National Economy post on 28 May 1921, and on 26 May of 1921 he was appointed Deputy Chairman of the Council of Labor and Defense, or STO, of the RSFSR under Lenin. With Lenin increasingly sidelined by ill health, Rycoff became his deputy at the Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars, the cabinet of the Soviet government. On December 29th, Rycoff joined the ruling Politburo of the Bolshevik Party. On April 3, 1922, after the 11th Party Congress, government reorganization in the wake of the formation of the Soviet Union in December 1922 resulted in Rycoff's appointment as chairman of the USSR Supreme Council of the national economy, Vysenka, or NEC, and Deputy Chairman of the USSR Council of People's Commissars on 6 July 1923. After Lenin's 1922 stroke, the Politburo named Rycoff co-acting head of government along with Lev Kamenev. On July 26, 1923, Rycoff became the de facto premier or prime minister. After Lenin's January 21, 1924 death, Rycoff formally succeeded him as head of government, a post he retained until the end of 1930, when Vyacheslav Molotov and his government replaced him, and his government also, Molotov bringing in his own cabinet. Now, the war danger, the UK and Germany, Poland and Romania, Tukhachevsky's thesis. In May of 1923, Stanley Baldwin was the Tory or Conservative Party Prime Minister of the UK. The focus of Baldwin's foreign policy was the destruction of Bolshevism via the overthrow of the Soviet government. At this time, Lenin was in the depths of his final episode of strokes, and the party was led by Joseph Stalin. Stalin focused the Cheka's foreign operations on staying informed about how this Brit plot to attack the USSR was progressing. It was taking a while for the Baldwin plot to get off the ground because of the rise to power of Hitler in 1933, and then the January 1935 death of the first monarch, George V. Baldwin served. The Baldwin plot was further delayed by the replacement of George V by Edward VIII, who had been David the Prince of Wales, and later would be the Duke of Windsor. David was for a German-led assault on the USSR. However, he wanted to do it with Hitler in command of Germany. Baldwin wanted Hitler replaced first by a German more acceptable to the British ruling class. The London-Berlin-Rome axis. Baldwin's plan was to create a London-Berlin-Rome-European capitalist axis with a sober German at the helm of Germany. As we have seen, one historical occurrence after another kept creating delays in Baldwin's planning. It would not be until after King Edward's departure and the way the Spanish Civil War unfolded that Baldwin would consent in November 1937 to Hitler as the chief of Germany and as the vanguard of his London-Berlin-Rome axis. Baldwin then sent Lord Halifax to Hitler to formalize his surrender to Hitler's leadership. Now the CPSU-B, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, parentheses, Bolsheviks, end of parentheses, Politburo, led by Comrade Stalin, was well aware of all of this Baldwin plotting. Baldwin's plot was the focus of the British tactics throughout the first year of the Spanish Civil War. Now this focused Stalin on the potential threat of a London-Berlin-Rome axis against the USSR. To recap, after the September 1936 Stalin intervention in Spain via direct USSR aid to the Spanish Republic and the sending of internationalist troops, Baldwin's plot gave up its initial formulation. Baldwin's initial demand that Hitler be replaced in Germany was abandoned in 1937. Baldwin then moved to accepting Hitler as chief of his proposed anti-Soviet London-Berlin-Rome axis. Lord Halifax was Baldwin's emissary to Hitler in November 1937. After Lenin's January 21, 1924 death, and through the years 1925 and 1926, our primary war concern was on our Western Front. The triumvirate in charge of strategy and tactics was 1. War Commissar Michael Frunze, and 2. his successor Klim Voroshilov, and 3. the commanding general and chief of the Red Army General Staff, Michael Tukhachevsky. Against them was 1. the threat from revenge-seeking Poland, 2. the threat from feudal Romania, 3. the threat from the motley crew in the reactionary East European satrapy of Bulgaria, and 4. finally, there were threats from the reactionary regimes in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. Tukhachevsky concluded, after analyzing the combined weight of these enemies vis-a-vis the Red Army, that we could not win if we were attacked by their combined weight. One reason was that we would not be able to mobilize our great advantage in manpower in sufficient time. His answer was for the USSR to launch the first attack against these enemies, that is, to conduct a preventive war by delivering the first blow. His own strategy called, therefore, for a special kind of mass mobilization, including the construction of a special supportive MIC, military-industrial complex, and properly equipped Red Army for such a strike. This would not be the long-term heavy industry-based strategy of other Red Army professionals. Tukhachevsky's military strategy thesis was not the first choice of the Bolshevik Party chief Joseph Stalin. There would be far-reaching ramifications to this division between Tukhachevsky and Stalin, and this is an important thing for you to realize. At this particular moment, you have a choice of either getting ready for a first strike, which means a certain kind of construction and expenditures of things that are going to be used right now, as opposed to a long-term preparation of military-industrial complex to get ready for the kind of world war that Stalin thinks is going to unfold. So that's the reason for coming through all of this right now. At a meeting of Rycoff's commission held on 29 July 1926 to discuss mobilization readiness and the Red Army's 1926 to 1927 budget, Voroshilov and Chief of Staff Michael Tukhachevsky combined to paint a frightening picture of the underfunded Soviet military. Despite their personal rivalry, Tukhachevsky and Voroshilov could cooperate to defend the Red Army, and Voroshilov told Rycoff's commission that he had met privately with Dzerzhinsky, who died soon after their meeting. This meeting he's talking about. Dzerzhinsky had been warned him and Tukhachevsky of an impending attack on the USSR. Now this intelligence led Voroshilov to evaluate the Red Army's preparedness, and he had found that the Locarno Agreement had only unsettled Eastern Europe, pushing Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states to active alignment against the USSR. To make matters worse, Britain was not only supporting that coalition, but also fomenting anti-Soviet activities in Afghanistan and Iran. Tukhachevsky joined his colleagues in asserting that the Soviet Union's western border states could draw on a pool of 6,710,000 men, of whom 4,290,000 had military training, allowing them to muster 111 rifle divisions, plus cavalry and aircraft. Given their reserves, these reactionary capitalist states could field an additional 150 rifle divisions with British assistance and production from the rapidly growing Polish military industry. This weighed against the 91 rifle divisions and 3.17 million men the USSR could field, and this meant to Tukhachevsky that the Soviet Union could not prevail in an extended war. His solution was a strategy aiming at quick victory, a conclusion with profound implications for the allocation of resources right now. Scarce funds should not go to industrial investment, since by the time Soviet industry made its presence felt in any future war, sheer weight of numbers would tell against the USSR. Instead, because quick victory was essential, spending had to create a Red Army able to go on the offensive at a moment's notice and disrupt the deployment of forces by its enemies. Tukhachevsky buttressed his advocacy of preventive war by pointing out the sorry state of the Red Army's stockpiles. Nearly a third of the soldiers mobilized would not have uniforms. There was a severe shortage of modern light machine guns, and the Red Army could count on repeating World War I's shell shortage almost as soon as the war began. Even given a year to expand production, Soviet industry would not approach the level of production the Red Army would require. In short, the Soviet Union would be incapable of repelling serious attack in the autumn of 1926, and here Tukhachevsky drew the opposite conclusion from that drawn by Svechin in his book Strategy. Svechin had suggested that the path to victory lay through attrition in long defensive struggles. Tukhachevsky saw that as leading to defeat, and pushed instead for preemptive strikes to counteract the Soviet Union's material weakness. Rycoff agreed with Tukhachevsky that the situation demanded quick action, and his commission resolved to take a series of urgent measures for strengthening the defensive potential of the USSR. In particular, the Commission would consider advances on next year's budget due to the catastrophic position of mobilization stocks. Now, to read the full explication of this argument, I recommend that you get the book Hammer and Stone by David R. Stone. It was published by University of Kansas Press in the year 2000, and read that. It's the most important modern analysis of what was happening with regard to Soviet preparation for World War II in the middle 1920s. And it was his, originally, that was his doctoral dissertation, and now it's a book. Strategy was a textbook written by Alexander Savechin when he was a professor at the Red Army General Staff School. He had been assigned there after a brief stint as Red Army Chief of Staff under Jukums Vasitas, the first Commander-in-Chief of the Red Army. Earlier, he had been the general in command of the Red Army's Smolensk district, and before that, he had been an important general in the Tsarist Army. The inherent problem with Tukhachevsky's solution was that most of the future appropriation would have to go to the purchase of materials that would strengthen the Army right now. The Rycoff Commission's working group, led by Comrade Chutskayev, pointed out that the requested 510 million ruble appropriation would be far insufficient to address the longer-term necessity of building the war industries. Only 173 million rubles of that additional appropriation was destined to war industry. At any rate, all sides realized that without the permission of the Finance Commissariat, which was already denied, all of this was just pissing into the wind. On the 7th of January 1927, the Party Central Committee full membership meeting, the Finance Commissariat would have its way not only for the preceding fiscal year, but for the present one as well, that is 1926-27. The War Commissariat budget went from 602 million rubles to 692 million rubles, far less than it wanted. Additional grants went from 167 million to 386 million rubles. Additional grants to military industry remained minimal, going from 27 to 44 million rubles. Without more money, the USSR confronted defeat in protracted war. Now this brings us to the January 1928 full Central Committee meeting, the 1927 to 28 Budget Authorization, crises on the Soviet borders, industry and agriculture, and finally some comments on why we could win. The party had the one thing that made it feasible to win every battle it now confronted, including the most severe accumulation of specific crises. That was its extremely good command and control of the entire administrative structure within the country, not to mention its ability to command fanatically loyal foreign de facto commando parties. This was Leninism in practice on a national and international level. This was also the logical extension of what General Secretary Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, his General and Chief of Staff, had done with the First International Working Men. And I just made a note here, which I think you should also remember to see the most recent biography of Frederick Engels entitled Marxist General, The Revolutionary Life of Frederick Engels, by former British Labour Party MP Tristram Hunt, published in 2009. By the time of the January 1928 full Central Committee meeting in Moscow, the party had had a full 10 years to get its act together organizationally. Despite all odds, it had succeeded in doing so. Now, the Soviet government was supposed to be, and was in fact, an implementation body for Bolshevik party policy. To the degree it made its own decisions, it was to do what was necessary to further party policy. In short, the Soviet government was a command government. The CPSU-B Political Bureau and Central Committee, through direct legal control, exercised that command, and through the fanatical devotion of government cadre, who were first and foremost always party cadre. The CPSU-B was fundamentally an implementation apparatus for the highest party authority. This was as it should be. This was exactly what Leninism was always all about in terms of organization. And the real hierarchy of authority was Highest in 1928 party authority was the General Secretary, Joseph Stalin, and under him the full Politburo, and under them the Secretariat, under that the full Central Committee, and finally the Party Congress and its members, which included all of the party's regional bosses. Now, at the 15th Party Congress, which lasted from the 2nd to the 19th of December in 1927, the Congress was made up of working committees. One of them dealt with the budgetary questions, including the military budgets, which would be the subject of a full 1928 Central Committee meeting. However, the overriding concerns confronting this Congress were political. All left opposition members had been expelled from the Central Committee in October 1927. Then, in November 1927, both Zinoviev and Trotsky had been expelled from the party. Christian Rakovsky and Lev Kamenev were allowed to speak on the December 1927 15th Congress, but the reception to them was very hostile. Rakovsky's speech was interrupted 57 times by his opponents, led by Bukharin, Ryutin, and Kaganovich. Now, Kamenev was interrupted 24 times by the same group, and at the end of the 15th Congress, both Rakovsky and Kamenev were expelled from the party. What we confronted then in January 1928, there were three specific crises confronting the party and its government at the beginning of 1928. These were, first of all, the complete collapse of the China policy the previous April of 1927. The overall failure to complete the infrastructure preparation to implant all of the acquired foreign technology and even domestically produced machinery. And thirdly, the scissors crisis in agriculture. Now at bottom, the last two of these crises occurred because there were insufficient financial resources to resolve them. This failure was itself due to having inherited an insufficiently developed capitalist mode of production. Now, we want to take a look at the affair at Shakhty in the Donbass region in 1928. This is the region which has absolutely refused to go along with the fascist regime in Kiev in the Ukraine at the moment. Now, the Russian word for mine shaft is Shakhty. The extreme southwestern Russian city of Shakhty was originally a tiny hamlet devoted to coal mining, founded in 1805 by a Tsarist sergeant major named Popov and known thereafter as Popova. It changed its name again before receiving the name Shakhty under the Soviet government, and that was after its liberation in the Civil War by Red Army General Sergei Ordzhonikidze in January 1921. Geographically, it is about 60 miles from Rostov-on-Don in the extreme southwestern corner of Russia in the Oblast of Rostov. After the counter-revolutionary traitor Gorbachev restored capitalism, the city fell apart economically and sunk into deep recession, but in its day it was a show city in many respects for the achievements of Stalinism as a civilization, and today it's being rebuilt under Mr. Putin. As you may recall, the Cheka was constantly being informed of quiet, but nevertheless real, subversive thought and conversations among the bourgeois specialist portion of the technical intelligentsia. This bourgeois specialist class never included the old Bolshevik specialists, nor did it include the newly emerging graduates of the red vocational and technical schools and universities. Anyway, between 1926 and 1928, the Shakhty coal-producing center had been falling behind its own production record. The Cheka had begun to investigate all these centers of declining rates of production to determine if sabotage, foreign or domestic in origin, was involved. On March 28, 1928, prosecutors returned a case against managers at the Shakhty coal mines. The police work leading to the prosecutor's indictment had been done under the command of Chekist Genrik G. Yagoda, appointed to the task of investigating Shakhty by Cheka chief Vyacheslav Minzinski. In April 1928, General Secretary Stalin commented that the Shakhty case proved that the bourgeoisie were using sabotage as a weapon against us, and that this danger would increase as our success in building the economic foundations of socialism grew. This was exactly as Lenin had predicted in his last testament. Some of the accused were shot, but most ended up in prison. Over the years, Leon Trotsky and his latter-day followers to this day have manufactured lie after lie about the trial and motivation behind it. Unfortunately, in the heartland of imperialism, these lies are about all the student can find to do an independent study. At any rate, you will have to get used to the fact that printed sources of information have been a pack of lies for well over half a century in the USA. Therefore, many other wise, reliable sources have no way of dealing with this. Wikipedia insists only on using published sources, which normally would be fine, except in the areas of politics and history, where everything in English about communism and Soviet Russia is a pack of lies. Wikipedia is further handicapped by the conspiracy of English-speaking Trotskyites to sit on top of the relevant pages. They see that tactic as critical to their campaign of falsehood and calumny against communism in general and Stalin in particular. Nevertheless, the Shakti affair is of political and historical significance. The party had no choice but to pursue a policy of replacing the inherently treasonous, endemic enemies that confronted us, the old bourgeois specialists. In 1935, the Donbass region would become the center of national attention again when Comrade Stakhanov emerged there as a heroic figure. He had produced 14 times his daily quota of coal in a little over 4 hours. Now, we shall return to him and the Donbass coal mines in later lectures. In April 1928, the Central Committee met and Stalin addressed the full Central Committee meeting from April 6th through 11th, 1928, spending the day of the 10th berating, beguiling, and in general duplicating Lenin's conduct at the 1907 Fifth Congress of the RSDLP, where all factions had been present, in London. Now, as we proceed, I shall take you to some of the examples he then presented affecting the industrialization and military preparation of the Soviet Union. This challenge had to be met together with the reorganization of agriculture that was to provide most of the funds to support both. Now, Stalin's July 1928 full Central Committee meeting report, I have reprinted in its totality in Volume 1. I'm just going to make a few summary comments right here for those of you that haven't been with us that long, because that was like 4 years ago, I think. In July 1928, Stalin delivered the main report to the full Central Committee meeting, and he focused on 3 areas: the upcoming 6th Comintern Congress and the new conditions in the world; secondly, the crisis in agriculture; thirdly, the situation concerning industrialization. And he began with a preview of what he would say to the upcoming 6th Comintern Congress. Quote, "The principal capitalist contradictions. Now it is the struggle between British capital and U.S. capital, which is the major contradiction in the capitalist world. Without denigrating the other capitalist contradictions, e.g., or for example, U.S. versus Japan, Britain versus France, etc., there is potential for Anglo-American war, and certainly there will be war here and there on the globe between the imperialist wolves. The second capitalist contradiction is between the imperialist countries and their colonies. Last year's shaking up of the foundations of Chinese society, and because of our Fifth Congress's decisions, the shaking up of Indian society are foremost among them. The contradiction between the capitalist world and the Soviet Union, which is becoming increasingly acute. There is the real possibility of war, as the capitalists may well attack us. The main immediate danger comes from imperialist pacifism in the guise of social democratism that effectively disarms those classes we must rely upon in the capitalist countries to prevent war emanating from their countries. This camouflage of social democratic pacifism is always the left hand in the capitalist boxing strategy, featuring fascism as its right hand knockout punch. Hence, the task of the communist parties is firstly to wage an unceasing struggle against social democratism in all spheres, in the economic and in the political sphere, including in the latter the exposure of bourgeois pacifism with the task of winning the majority of the working class for communism. and B, secondly, to form a united front of the workers of the advanced countries and the laboring masses of the colonies in order to stave off the danger of war. Alternatively, if war breaks out, to convert imperialist war into civil war, smash fascism, overthrow capitalism, establish Soviet power, emancipate the colonies from slavery, and organize all-round defense of the first Soviet republic in the world. Such are the principal problems and tasks confronting the Sixth Congress. Now, in Volume 1, as I say, I included Stalin's entire report to this Central Committee meeting of July 1928, and you should go back to that and read it now. And alternatively, it's available also at the always excellent Marxist Internet Archive. And that brings us to a conclusion of this lecture, and we're going to continue with this subject matter of building socialism in the next lecture, which will be 123D.